These were the final minutes of a day that had demanded more of him than his spirit could sustain. But from the outside, no one would have imagined that within that stillness hid a tension so deep it threatened to break at any instant. The scene seemed suspended, halted, in a breath too fragile, too silent for someone the public had learned to associate with an almost sacred serenity. It was exactly in that contrast where the truth that had remained hidden for so long began to reveal itself. For years, the industry had celebrated in him a calm that many interpreted as a sign of inner balance, an exceptional quality in a world dominated by urgency, overexposure, and the constant need to project security. Directors, producers, and viewers described him as a polished, harmonious figure, capable of softening the chaos that seemed to envelop every space of modern entertainment. His way of walking, his measured voice, even the way he tilted his head when listening to others, built an image that solidified as an idealized refuge for an audience anxious to find flawless figures. However, absolute serenity is slippery terrain in an environment that demands perpetual motion. What seemed like stability from the outside was in reality a thin thread holding the weight of expectations that grew faster than his inner self could process. Every public appearance reinforced a version of himself that did not always coincide with his intimate truth. There were gestures that others perceived as purity, when in reality they were desperate attempts to preserve a space where he could breathe without feeling judged. That contradiction became the origin of a tiny, almost imperceptible fracture that would take years to become visible, but whose presence began to disturb his delicate balance. Even so, no one seemed willing to question the foundation of that icon built on the idea of silent perfection. The public, accustomed to consuming clear narratives, preferred to maintain the illusion rather than ask what emotions were left out of the frame. In every brief greeting, in every carefully edited interview, Manglong sustained an internal tension that slowly began to erode his center. It was not a sudden break, but a delicate, persistent wearing down that distanced him a little more from himself every time he tried to fit into others' definitions. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damage, to understand how the entertainment world functions and how an icon is redefined. In the contrast between the public light and Menglong's private shadows lies the root of a story that reveals not only his fragility, but also the relentless functioning of a system that rarely grants space for doubt. Long before his name began to appear in the credits of recognized productions, Yu Menglong had developed a sensitivity that would accompany him like a constant whisper, almost imperceptible to those who did not know the nuances of his character. In the early years of his life, a lack of financial resources imposed a strict routine on his family, devoid of excesses and marked by long silences that did not signify absence, but a form of resistance against daily tensions. In that austere environment, young Manglong learned to find refuge in introspection. The stillness, which would later be celebrated by millions, emerged initially as a tool to survive in a space where uncertainty was part of the daily landscape. That disciplined childhood molded a deep need for emotional control. It was not about unshakable strength, but a mechanism to order a world that sometimes seemed too vast and too rigid. His gaze, even as a child, was full of unusual attention toward details invisible to the majority. He observed the expressions of those surrounding him, deciphered the small gestures others overlooked, and stored impressions that would later become an essential part of his interpretive skill. However, that same sensitivity that would enrich his art also sowed the seed of a fragility that time would make evident. When he discovered acting, he felt he had finally found a territory where he could pour out his emotional torrent without fear of breaking anything. The stage, even in its simplest form, became a space of inner freedom that counteracted the rigidity of his daily life. There, he could transform himself, translate silences into nuances, convert the tremor of his emotions into a comprehensible language. This encounter with art not only awakened a vocation, but also a silent hope. The possibility of building a future where his sensitivity was a bridge, not a weight. The day he decided to dedicate himself professionally to this discipline, he did so with a conviction that admitted no alternatives. Unlike other young performers, he did not have influential connections or an environment favoring the difficult path into the entertainment industry. What he had was a silent, almost devotional determination that accompanied him from his first auditions. Those present in that early stage remember a young man who listened with almost reverent respect, as if every word of instruction contained the key to ordering his future. He observed, analyzed, and absorbed every indication with a concentration so intense that many directors described him as a performer with an extraordinarily deep soul. This ironclad commitment quickly turned him into an emerging talent. Nevertheless, behind the serenity with which he presented himself to the world existed a silent fear he himself barely dared to name. The possibility of not measuring up to what others believed they saw in him. In an environment where speed, spontaneity, and constant exposure are common currency, his natural tendency toward reserve began to become a challenge. While some colleagues prospered thanks to extroverted charisma, Menglong leaned on introspection to maintain his inner balance. That way of protecting himself worked for a time, but it was also erroneously interpreted as a calculated distance. In the first major projects he obtained, he was submerged in an environment where emotional demand coexisted with the pressure to always appear accessible, willing, and socially synchronized with the sector's dynamics. Late night dinners, strategic conversations, encounters where cordiality was confused with convenience were part of the machinery sustaining relationships within the industry. Although he tried to integrate, every gesture had a cost. Rejecting an invitation he did not consider necessary, reserving time for himself, or remaining silent in an environment where everyone spoke ceaselessly began to be perceived as a challenge to the implicit norms of the medium. The personal coherence that was indispensable to him transformed into suspicion for those unaware of the complexity of his character. With the passage of time, the first signs of the emotional break began to present themselves in a form so subtle that at first not even he managed to recognize them clearly. A promised script that never arrived. A director who stopped showing the usual enthusiasm. A recommendation that vanished without explanations. From the outside, they were isolated facts, common situations within a system that constantly changes course. But inside him, they began to generate an increasingly deep bewilderment. He did not speak of it because he feared that expressing those doubts meant admitting a vulnerability he had tried to keep in balance since adolescence. The silent pressure grew like a wound that did not bleed, but hurt with progressive intensity. That serenity, which had distinguished him from the start, transformed into a space too fragile to contain the accumulated tension. What for others was a natural pause, for him became an abyss where he faced questions he did not know how to answer. The distance between what he showed and what he felt widened without anyone noticing, and in that uncertain terrain, the nucleus of the storm that would mark the rest of his trajectory began to form. What do you think of this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The first sign of the storm did not arrive with an evident scandal, but with an anonymous phrase published without conviction, almost like a whisper thrown into the digital void. It contained no direct accusations or verifiable assertions. It merely insinuated a nuance destined, perhaps unintentionally, to activate collective curiosity. However, in an ecosystem where emotions travel faster than facts, that light insinuation became a spark capable of igniting a fire impossible to contain. No one in Yu Menglong's circle imagined that such a vague statement could transform into the unstoppable current that would end up dragging him toward a terrain where truth would lose relevance. At first, it was just a comment, passing from one user to another, without much attention, accompanied by the habitual indifference of spaces saturated with ephemeral opinions. But something in the tone of those words, an ambiguous nuance, an insinuation stronger than its content, adhered to the imagination of those wandering in search of stories they could interpret according to their own emotions. What began as an isolated murmur took shape through repetition, and with each new dissemination, the meaning of the phrase expanded beyond its original intention. It was as if every reader added a personal layer of interpretation, generating a narrative that grew with a life of its own. When Manglong became aware of what was occurring, the wave had already surpassed the limits of the reasonable. There was no clear starting point or gradual transition. One morning, his name dawned, converted into an axis of suspicion, a distorted mirror in which the multitude sought to validate their fears, prejudices, and disenchantments. The serenity that for years had been his greatest quality began to be reinterpreted as a sign of coldness, as if that characteristic silence hid a dark intention. What previously fascinated now unsettled. Public opinion, always changing, found in his stillness an opportunity to project any unresolved emotion. In a matter of hours, suspicion transformed into a trend. Social networks, accustomed to devouring instant emotions, converted ambiguity into emotional certainty. Followers who had accompanied him since his first works rushed to defend him, appealing to his trajectory marked by dedication, discretion, and a sensitivity many considered unique. But the other half, driven by the need to fill any void with a coherent story, fed unfounded theories that gained strength due to their constant repetition. The fracture between both groups grew rapidly, generating an environment where conflict seemed inevitable. Traditional media joined this polarization. Entertainment programs dedicated entire segments to analyzing his past appearances, adopting a tone suggesting that the truth had always been in plain sight, waiting to be deciphered. Images from old interviews were cropped to emphasize gestures that taken out of context, seem to acquire a different meaning. Natural pauses in his answers were interpreted as signs of arrogance or manipulation. Even brief silences were used as arguments to sustain the idea that there was something hidden behind his habitual serenity. Thus, Manglong's public figure began to blur under an accumulation of outside interpretations, alien to his inner reality. Professional consequences did not take long to manifest. Some brands suspended collaborations with formal and brief messages, justifying it as a necessary evaluation to avoid future risks. Other projects, announced with enthusiasm weeks prior, disappeared without explanation. And, in a silent but implacable manner, the algorithms that previously boosted his presence began to relegate him. His name ceased to appear among positive trends, and his digital visibility was reduced with the same speed with which it had once grown. The system that had elevated him now retreated with a coldness so structured that it was difficult to distinguish if it was an automatic reaction or a conscious decision. The emotional impact was devastating. Close witnesses recounted a subtle but profound change in his countenance. He continued to show the delicacy characterizing him, but new shadows appeared in his gaze, a weariness unrelated to physical activity or long days of shooting. He walked with a different calm, a calm that seemed closer to resignation than to inner peace. Every step reflected the weight of an uncertainty accumulating day after day, as if he were advancing over ground, crumbling beneath his feet. Even those who defended him began to feel that the effort required an emotional strength escaping their possibilities. Messages of support multiplied, but they were quickly drowned out by the intensity of the theories, reproaches, and speculations. In an attempt to understand what was happening, many reviewed his previous work looking for signs that might have gone unnoticed. What they found were not answers, but a mixture of admiration and sadness upon discovering that the sensitivity he had always shown was now reinterpreted as vulnerability, exploited by a system that does not forgive doubt. The media avalanche did not stop. It had no clear origin or foreseeable end. It was, in essence, an emotional movement mixing fear, curiosity, and a collective need to project uncertainties onto the figure of someone who had never learned to protect himself from that public intensity. Manglong was trapped in the middle of a current that reduced his voice to a faint, almost imperceptible echo. Every day that passed moved him further away from the image he had built with patience and discipline, while the public consumed fragmented versions of his story without stopping to consider the human cost of those interpretations. In that tumult, the figure that once represented serenity became a symbol moldable by any narrative, incapable of defending itself against machinery that had lost interest in the truth. The storm kept growing, and he, in his attempt to remain firm, remained increasingly exposed before a collective judgment that did not understand his silences or his way of existing in a world where the immediate always surpasses the intimate. The silence that enveloped Yu Menglong after the media avalanche did not have the softness many would have imagined. It was not a necessary pause to recover, nor a respite allowing him to reorganize his thoughts. It was, rather, the antechamber of a void that began to expand within him with unbearable slowness, as if that silence had become a presence capable of occupying every corner of his life. With the decrease of public noise, what remained was not relief, but the disturbing sensation of being suspended in a space that no longer belonged to him. There began the darkest stage of his journey, a territory where absence became heavier than any accusation. His schedule, previously full of commitments, transformed into a landscape plagued by cancellations. Meetings confirmed weeks ago vanished via formal and brief messages, without offering explanation or hope of rescheduling. The projects that had fueled his motivation faded without notice, remaining trapped in a limbo that would never be resolved. Calls that previously marked the cadence of his work stopped arriving, replaced by a tense silence underlining the speed with which an entire sector could withdraw its trust without uttering a word. That silent withdrawal was more devastating than a direct rejection. It was the confirmation that, in the structure of entertainment, invisibility could impose itself in a manner as implacable as any explicit condemnation. Those who visited him in those days coincided on a disturbing detail. Manglong was still kind, polite, attentive, but in every gesture there was a slight delay, like a shadow sliding behind his habitual behavior. His movements, previously guided by a natural serenity, acquired a slowness revealing a deep weariness, difficult to describe. It was not bodily fatigue, but a wearing down born from the impossibility of finding a place to rest his spirit. He walked with the air of someone advancing over terrain, giving way beneath his feet, without noticing that every step sank him a little further into the sensation of loss. During that period, Manglong began to share with his inner circle thoughts he had kept hidden for years. He spoke of the difference between the fame that liberates and the fame that imprisons. He confessed that in his case, the progressive exposure accompanying his trajectory had become a rigid structure, incapable of allowing doubts or fragilities. The serenity that had defined him transformed into an unbearable weight, because the outside world had turned that trait into a permanent expectation. His voice, always so measured, adopted a different nuance, as if every word were chosen with effort so as not to overflow with emotions he no longer knew how to contain. The walks, which previously offered him clarity, became a reflection of his inner state. People who found him by chance recounted that he advanced with a calm bordering on resignation, as if his body remained in the present while his mind wandered through a distant and inaccessible territory. Photographs taken without his knowledge showed a man who still retained the delicacy of his gestures, but whose gaze was full of an indescribable weight. It was the look of someone who knew themselves trapped in a space without exits, where every attempt to move forward returned him to the same starting point. The pressure increased in a silent but devastating way. The industry, which had once celebrated his presence, adopted a calculated mutismo silence. There were no official declarations or public vetoes, nor new accusations. What existed was something more subtle, and therefore crueler. They simply stopped counting on him. His name was omitted from internal conversations. Proposals he himself had pushed remained filed away without a recipient, and any attempt to reactivate his career crashed against an invisible wall. The system had handed down a sentence without pronouncing it, exercising its weight with the naturalness of a process considered inevitable. The darkest point arrived one night when Manglong could not sleep. He remained seated for hours, observing how the light filtered slowly through the window, as if the dawn were an answer he no longer expected. There was no precise event explaining his state. It was the sum of silences, absences, and broken expectations. In that solitude, charged with meanings, he experienced a vulnerability so deep that not even the discipline guiding his entire life could sustain him. It was then that he understood, perhaps with more clarity than ever, that he had lost his place in the world. When the news of his death spread, it did so with a brutal speed, contrasting with the silence that had marked his final months. This belief propagated among those following his trajectory and among those who barely knew him through his performances. Social media, which at the time contributed to eroding his image, reacted with a mixture of shock and a desperate search for meaning. Fragments of interviews, previously used as proof of unfounded theories, returned to circulation, although now charged with a melancholy that tinged every gaze and every pose. Where coldness was interpreted before, fragility was now seen. Where distance had been pointed out, sensitivity emerged. His death generated an unexpected turn in the public conversation. Attention ceased to center on what he had supposedly done and shifted toward what he had endured. The focus changed. There was talk of these structures, allowing a respected figure to end up submerged in such deep loneliness without anyone noticing. The industry, accustomed to moving forward without stopping for its collateral damage, was forced, at least for an instant, to look at its own reflection. In private debates and specialized forums, a question arose that no one had formulated while he was alive. How is it possible that a man of such integrity was driven to such a devastating limit without any signal being heeded? In the following weeks, those who reviewed his work discovered nuances that had gone unnoticed. Every scene acquired a new meaning, as if the emotions he interpreted had been inadvertent windows into an inner world that was not seen in time. His characters, previously celebrated for their depth, began to be perceived as involuntary reflections of a sensitivity he had tried to protect from public scrutiny. His serenity was no longer interpreted as a feature of perfection, but as a delicate form of emotional survival. What he left behind was not an idealized image, but a persistent echo, forcing a reconsideration of the way public narratives are consumed. The conversation no longer revolved around a scandal, but around human fragility in an environment confusing silence with indifference and vulnerability with weakness. His story marked a before and after in the collective perception, a silent call to recognize the emotional cost of those living exposed to gazes that do not always seek to understand. The echo of the life and farewell of Yu Menglong found its definitive place in a territory where the bustle no longer dominated the public conversation. As media attention shifted toward other names and other narratives, what remained was a more intimate understanding of his journey, a memory rebuilt from the belated recognition of his vulnerability. His figure ceased to be associated with scandal and began to become a reference point to reflect on how the entertainment industry demands constant strength, even when those inhabiting it need a space to breathe, doubt, or ask for help without fear of consequences. Thus, his story transformed into a mirror where tensions that were always present were revealed, although rarely admitted with frankness. In professional circles, an analysis emerged that did not seek to point out individual culprits, but to understand how the very structure of the system had contributed silently to his isolation. Producers, performers, and representatives began to recognize the urgency of generating environments where expressing uncertainty was not interpreted as a threat, but as a legitimate manifestation of humanity. Manglong's trajectory demonstrated that discipline and sensitivity can coexist, but it also made clear that the absence of support networks leaves artists exposed to wear and tear that can prove irreversible. The serenity so many admired acquired a different meaning. It was no longer seen as flawless armor, but as a delicate way of sustaining oneself before an environment that seldom offers a safe refuge. Those who reviewed his work with a new gaze found nuances that had gone unnoticed in an era when an immutable image was expected of him. His interpretations, celebrated for their emotional harmony, began to be perceived as expressions of a depth that had not been understood in its entirety. The intensity inhabiting his characters revealed an intimate connection with a sensitivity the public was only now starting to recognize. That reinterpretation did not pretend to turn him into a tragic hero, but to grant him the place deserved by any human being whose life has been molded by circumstances surpassing their resistance. The general reflection left by his story became a warning and, at the same time, an invitation. It reminded us that visibility does not guarantee understanding, and that silence, far from meaning disinterest, can be a fragile shield against emotional pressures difficult to name. In an environment where informational speed tends to simplify even the most complex experiences, his legacy drives one to question the way public narratives are consumed and to recognize that behind every recognized figure exists a life that should not be reduced to a single interpretation. The impact of his story extends beyond his own trajectory, opening questions, inviting a reconsideration of the limits between collective perception and personal truth. Understanding what happened does not imply solely reviewing the facts, but also recognizing what can still be transformed. The memory of Yu Menglong remains as a call to value authenticity, even when it presents itself in silence, and as a reminder that empathy remains fundamental to building a more human environment within a system that rarely allows space for fragility. Now, the question is directed at us. What do we do with this knowledge? How can we prevent stories like his from repeating under new forms and new names? The answer, although extensive, begins with a simple gesture: to look with greater depth, listen with patience, and remember that vulnerability is not a defect, but an intrinsic condition of human existence. If you wish for us to analyze the story of another artist or to delve into an aspect still hidden, in this case, you may indicate it. The tale continues, and you can decide what the next chapter will be. In the gloom of a narrow hallway, lit only by the weak light filtering in from a high window, Yu Menglong remained motionless, as if time had renounced moving forward in his presence.